Dust coiled in slow, lazy ribbons along the prairie road, lifting and falling as if it carried the size of every traveler who'd ever passed through. The late sun pressed gold into the land, but there was no warmth in the air, only the kind of brittle chill that settles before night claims the horizon. A lone wagon rattled into view, its wheels whispering over gravel, its canvas side stained by miles of road. Elias Boone stood at the gate, broad shoulders squared though his shirt was worn at the elbows, eyes narrowed against the light. He had been waiting. He'd been waiting a long time. The wagon drew to a stop. A woman stepped down, tall, beautiful. Her dress a green that might have looked rich in town, but here only showed the dust. Marjorie Whitlow held her skirts as if the earth itself might stain her, gaze flicking over Elias once, twice, and then away. He saw the decision in her face before she spoke. Pride had already taken root. "I can't do this," she said. Her voice tightened quick, like a door slamming shut. Elias didn't answer. Words weren't a tool he wasted when they'd do no good. He watched her climb back into the wagon, skirts snapping in the wind, and with a slap of the rein she was gone, trailing a plume of dust behind her. He remained at the gate, the sun sliding lower until it touched the tips of the far hills. The prairie had always been quiet, but now the silence felt heavy, pressing at his ribs. In a town like Dawson Creek, news traveled faster than the wind. By morning, the story would be told in every doorway. The mail-order bride who took one look at Elias Boone's place and turned her back. He turned toward the cabin, each step deliberate. Rejection wasn't new to him. A man who worked land like this, who carried his wealth in callous hands instead of coins, learned early that most folks saw only what they wanted. Still, the sting sat in him like a burr under the skin. The creek ran a short walk from the cabin, and he went there now, bucket in hand, thinking of chores. The sound of the water reached him before the trees did, a thin trickle over stones. He was almost at the bank when movement caught his eye. Two small shapes crouched near his fence line, still as stones. They were girls, one no more than 9, the other perhaps 6, their bare feet white with dust, their braids loosened by wind. They didn't look at him when he approached, only kept their eyes low, as though afraid the sight of their faces might give something away. The older one spoke first, voice small but firm. "Our mama is sick, sir. We'll clean your cabin for food." Elias studied them. The older girl, Waya, he would learn, held herself like a sapling in a storm, thin but unbending. The younger, Ahiv, half hid behind her sister's side, her small fingers clutching fabric that had long since lost its color. Pride lived in them, though hunger shadowed their cheeks. He set the bucket down, not close enough to startle them, and said, "Come on in, then, but you eat first." They hesitated at the threshold of his cabin, eyes flicking from the stacked wood to the iron stove, to the table where steam rose from a kettle. Elias cut thick slices from a loaf baked that morning, the crust cracking under the knife. He set them beside a plate of beans and a jar of honey. The girls ate carefully, slow, as if unsure the food wouldn't be taken back. He didn't press them for words. Some hungers were quiet ones. The light outside was fading when the sound of wagon wheels returned. Elias went to the door, and for a moment he thought Marjorie had come back. But the figure who climbed down was different, smaller, lighter in step, though the same green eyes studied him with cautious resolve. "My name's Clara," she said, Marjorie's sister. The words caught slightly, as though she hadn't decided until the last moment to speak them aloud. She won't be coming back. I thought maybe I could take her place." Elias leaned a hand against the doorframe. He had the look of a man measuring something against the light, though he wasn't sure what. Clara's dress was plain, her hair braided tight against the wind, no rings on her hands. She didn't carry Marjorie's sharpness. Instead, there was a quiet steadiness in her gaze, like she'd known too many goodbyes already. Inside, Wyatt and Ahiv had gone still, watching the stranger with the wary eyes of children who had learned that new faces often meant new rules. Clara noticed them immediately. "You have company," she said softly. "They're helping out," Elias replied. Clara stepped past him without another word, setting down the small carpet bag she carried. She knelt beside the table, speaking to the girls in a voice low enough that Elias couldn't catch the words. only the gentle rhythm of them. Waya's shoulders eased first. Ahiv's hand relaxed its grip on her sister's sleeve. The lamplight deepened as the sky outside darkened into cobalt. Elias sat at the table, repairing a leather strap, while Clara washed the supper dishes, the girls at her side. She worked with quiet efficiency, not looking for praise or asking for instruction. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, her hands small but quick in the warm water. Waya handed her plates. Ahiv dried them with a cloth that trailed the floor. Now and then, the girls would whisper to each other in a language Elias didn't know, their words rising and falling like wind through pine boughs. It was a strange sort of peace that settled in the cabin then. Not the kind that comes from silence, but from the sound of work done without complaint. Elias watched it, without meaning to, his mind half on the strap in his hands and half on the way the lamplight caught the curve of Clara's cheek, the concentration in her brow. She hadn't asked him for anything, not shelter, not promise, not even explanation. That in itself was rare. By the time the dishes were stacked and the stove banked for the night, the girls were fighting to keep their eyes open. Clara guided them to a blanket in the corner, tucking them in with the ease of someone used to caring for others before herself. Elias rose, meaning to offer her the cot, but she only shook her head. "I'm fine here," she said, glancing toward the small bench by the hearth. The fire's glow painted the walls, softening the hard edges of the room. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the distant howl of some night creature across the plains. Inside, there was the creak of wood, the faint crackle of coals, and the quiet breathing of the sleeping children. Clara sat with her hands in her lap, eyes on the fire, as if she were thinking of all the miles that had brought her here and all the miles yet to come. Elias found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, some stories didn't start the way folks expected. Some didn't begin with the spark of love or the crush of desire. Some began like this, with the weight of necessity, the quiet persistence of strangers who shared bread and space and said little more than was needed. When he finally turned in, the cabin felt different somehow. Not warmer, not brighter, but steadier, as if the wind outside could batter the walls all night and still find nothing loose enough to carry away. He didn't know how long Clara would stay, or what would come the bargain they hadn't truly made. But as he lay listening to the soft breaths of three others in the dark, he knew one thing. The loneliness he'd worn like a second skin all these years had, for this night at least, been set aside. Winter edged into the days with a pale, relentless hand. The mornings came rimmed in frost, the grass brittle underfoot, and the creek's thin surface glazed with ice before noon. Life in the cabin settled into a rhythm that felt both fragile and sure. Clara rose before the sun, coaxing the stove to life with kindling, the scent of coffee curling into the rafters. Elias would step out into the cold without complaint, his breath clouding, his boots biting into frozen earth as he checked the livestock. The girls, still half dreaming, would creep to the table and wrap themselves in the quilt Clara draped over their shoulders, watching her stir the pot. It was not a household built on talk. Words were sparse, chosen with care. But each day left its mark in small acts, a repaired seam on a worn dress, a handful of apples left in the girl's basket, Elias mending the hinge on Clara's trunk without being asked. In town, such quiet would have been mistaken for distance. Here, it became the thread that bound them. Yet word from Dawson Creek did not stop at the cabin door. Mrs. Pritchard arrived one brittle morning, her bonnet tied too tightly under her chin, her smile thin as paper. She perched in the doorway, eyes darting past Clara to the sight of Waya, and Ahiv sorting kindling by the stove. "I do hope you're keeping proper," she said, her tone suggesting the opposite. "Folks are talking. Elias, a man living under one roof with a girl who ain't his wife, and with extras underfoot, it does get tongues wagging." Elias met her gaze with the kind of stillness that could make a lesser person fidget. "You've had your say," he replied, stepping aside just enough to close the door between them. Clara kept her eyes on the pot, but her cheeks were flushed, the set of her shoulders stiff. Later, when Elias passed her the bread, their hands brushed, and he saw something in her eyes, not shame, but a weary awareness of how little it took to bruise a woman's name. Days shortened. Snow began to fall in quiet, hesitant flakes, layering the land in a muted hush. The girls had taken to visiting the creek for water in the afternoons, their laughter a small bright sound against the stillness. On one such day, dusk had already folded over plains when Clara noticed they had not yet returned. She stepped outside, scanning the distance, the air sharp in her lungs. Elias appeared from the barn, saw her expression, and didn't ask questions, only grabbed a lantern. They followed the narrow track toward the cottonwoods, the lantern's circle of light, swaying over frostbitten grass. The quiet was not the peace of winter, but something tighter, stretched thin. In the dim, the trees loomed like blackened ribs, the creek just beyond. A sound, low, guttural, curled through the air. Clara froze. Near the bend in the creek, Wyatt and Ahiv stood pressed together, their backs to the water, eyes wide. Between them and the path crouched a coyote, ribs sharp against its pelt, teeth glinting when the lantern caught them. It was thin, desperate, and too close. Elias moved before Clara could call his name. He stepped into the light, placing himself squarely between the animal and the children. His voice was low, firm. "Go on now." He stooped, scooping a fist-sized stone, and hurled it. The coyote flinched but did not retreat. A second stone followed, cracking against the frozen ground at its feet. The creature's ears flattened. It took a step back, then another, before slinking into the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. Clara was already at the girl's side, her arms wrapping around them, feeling their trembling to the layers of cloth. Wyatt clung to her without a word. I had buried her face in Clara's coat. Elias stood for a moment longer, scanning the dark, before turning back. His breath was ragged, not from fear but from the cold biting deep. The walk home was slow, careful. The lantern swung low, their steps muffled in the snow. Now and then, Clara glanced at Elias, catching his profile something she hadn't seen before, a kind of unguarded steadiness. Not for himself, but for all of them. Back at the cabin, the girls were bundled into bed, their faces pale in the firelight, but calmer. Clara poured Elias a tin cup of coffee, the steam fogging the space between them. "Thank you," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. He didn't answer right away, just set the cup aside and reached for the log pile, feeding the fire. "They're under this roof," he said at last. "That's enough reason." The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters. Inside, the room held a warmth that felt heavier than the fire could give. Clara sat back in her chair, watching the flames flicker over the walls, and realized she was no longer thinking about the road behind her or the one ahead. The space between them, between all four of them, was no longer empty. Morning brought a clear sky, the world wrapped in fresh snow. Elias was already outside, checking the stock, when Clara stepped onto the porch with her shawl pulled tight. Wyatt and Ahiv tumbled out after her, their laughter rising in the cold air as they chased each other across the yard, their footprints marking the untouched white. When Elias returned, his boots heavy with snow, he paused beside her. "If you stay," he said, his voice even, "we'll make this place a home." There was no demand in it, no plea, only the plain truth, offered like a hand held out. She looked at him then, not at the weathered lines of his face or the roughness of his hands, but at the way he stood, not between her and the world, but with her against it. The girls' voices carried over the snow, bright and fearless. And for the first time in longer than she could name, Clara felt the weight she'd been carrying ease, just enough to breathe without thinking about it. That night, long after the girls were asleep and the fire had sunk to embers, Clara sat by the window, watching the moon lay its silver path over the snow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Not the desperate snarl from before, but a far-off cry that faded into the stillness. She thought of the road that had brought her here, of the shame that had been planted in other people's words, of the quiet in this cabin that felt nothing like loneliness. The narrator's voice might have said, if there had been one, that some love is not the storm but the shelter found when the wind is loud, that the worth of a man is measured not by the size of his land, but by the space he leaves for others to stand beside him, and that sometimes the most lasting promises are spoken not in vows, but in mornings where the coffee is poured, the bread is sliced, and the door stays open. As she rose to bank the fire, she caught Elias watching from the shadows, his eyes steady, unreadable, yet carrying the same thought she now knew for certain. Whatever road lay ahead, They would walk it under the same roof. And for the first time, that felt like enough.